Good morning, North America. Welcome to Church Talk Radio and all things church transformation. I'm your co-host, Dr. Bill Tenney Britton, in our studio in Columbia, Missouri, the heartland of the U.S. And as usual, I'm joined by my co-host, author and denominational leader, Dr. Kris Tenney Britton, the area minister of the Northeast area of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ of Mid-America. Try and say that 3 times fast. Good morning, Kris.
Well, good morning, good morning, good morning, and welcome to Church Talk. Glad you're here with us this week.
Yeah, welcome, and we're rocking and rolling and we're ready to go. We're talking about an important topic today, and so I think we ought to jump right into it.
Yeah, I agree. It's kind of funny. We're going to talk about creating spiritual conversations, the key to culturally relevant evangelism, but we're not going to be conversing. We're going to kind of be, in a way, conversing, but not, don't do as we do as we suggest.
As I say, all right,
How's
exactly.
That? There we go.
Exactly.
There
Okay,
we go.
so,
Okay.
all right. We're talking about creating spiritual conversation. This is the key to culturally relevant evangelism. You know, once upon a time, I can remember, well, you know that I started a church in the 1980s in Dothan, Alabama. I was one of the evangelists for a church start. And the way we did the church start was we knocked on doors and did the survey, what would you be looking for in a church or whatever. But we always got to that last question, if you died tonight, you know for sure you'd go to heaven. And in Dothan, Alabama, they'd always said, well, yes. And then you say, what'd you base that on? And no matter what they said, no matter what their answer was, you'd ask, would you like to know what the Bible says about that? And ultimately, they'd invite you in. And I would go through this really a rote presentation. I'm not customize it for myself, but I went through this presentation, and they'd accept Christ as Savior and so on and so forth. And it really wasn't a conversation in any way, shape, or form. Right. It was a presentation of the gospel, if you will. It was based not on relationship, but it was based on a perceived interest that the person who invited you in, and in some ways we probably were making the most out of Southern hospitality, but it was also a different era, a different age. Today, if you ask someone, would you like to know what the Bible has to say about whatever, especially about a question like, are you going to die and go to heaven? The response very often is, so why would I want to know what the Bible has to say, or along those lines, because the Bible no longer has the authority that it used to have. And so, although that works with about 2% of the population, we know that this method still does work. It's still effective, but only with about 2-3% of the population the most. The way that evangelism is done most effectively today is over a period of time with lots of spiritual conversations, and conversations that begin by building relationships. And not every conversation is a spiritually focused, although there may be some spiritually based parts in there. And of course, the conversation is always bathed in, we hope, in prayer, as a believer and someone who is unchurched or not a believer has a conversation. So it's a different paradigm of doing evangelism today, and spiritual conversations are the cornerstone of culturally relevant evangelism in this day and time.
Well, I'd like to say that thank you very much for giving evangelism a bad name, because you were part of that movement, but so was I, so I can't argue. Anyways, it is true, and I think that's what a lot of us are afraid of. Oh my gosh, I don't know the right words to say. I don't know, what if they ask me questions that I don't know how to answer, or knock on a door, what if they don't want to see me? But it is very, very different. So hopefully this will help reclaim evangelism for new generations and many generations to come.
Well, as you say that, I just want to do a shout out for the National Evangelistic Association.com, which is, their whole focus is, if you will, revitalizing, redeeming the word evangelism, and helping people to understand that evangelism isn't a dirty word anymore, or it doesn't have to be, and it really never was. It's just we're still trying to use old methods in a new context, and in general that doesn't work. In fact, in general, it does more damage than it does good. And so we need to not so much lighten up, but figure out that what worked in 1980 doesn't work in 2010 and for the foreseeable future.
Sure.
And it's about conversations.
Right. Well, let's talk about conversation for a moment, because as we are wont to say, we've really lost the fine art of conversation in this day and time. And it's being, the ramifications of that are being multiplied these days with the rise of texting and tweeting and email, Facebooking, IMing, whatever. And I will say, I'm not saying negative things about those. Those are valid or can be valid forms of communication. They're really important. We take full advantage of both of those.
But it's not conversation. Let's be honest.
It's not conversation. Yeah, but for a lot of us, we think that communication is conversation.
Right, exactly.
And unfortunately, in those cases, except maybe in IMing, those are really monologues. I'm going to say something and I've put it out there, and maybe somebody will comment on that, but we're not really having a conversation. Now, conversations don't necessarily have to be face-to-face. We're hoping, though, when you have spiritual conversations, that they'll be face-to-face. But when we're talking about conversation, we're not talking about monologuing, or as you were saying, presentation. You know, you weren't having a conversation with those folks. You went in with the end in mind. And a conversation doesn't really have an end in mind, except hopefully the end is that the conversation, or that you'll both be richer and higher and better than you were when you started.
I want to disagree. I want to disagree on that point. There is an end to the conversation.
Okay.
And the end goal of the conversation is to leave the door open for future conversations.
All right, that's good. Okay.
That's the end.
Right.
That's the end goal of a conversation, is that there will be more conversations, and that's just about being civil, polite. It's about what a conversation is.
But I'd like to add that you're both going to be better. But the participants in that conversation are going to be, quote, better, whatever that means in the context.
Better acquainted
than when you
or
got
whatever.
started.
Right.
But a lot of conversations don't go that way at all. They're really discussions, if you will.
Well, there's a huge difference between a conversation and a discussion.
So say more.
A conversation is two-way, and we'll talk more about what a conversation is in a moment, but what a conversation isn't is a discussion. And a discussion is when you put two or more people together, and the one doing, well, either both could be doing it.
Yeah, sure.
But where you have an agenda. You've come in with an agenda and you want to present that agenda. Now, it's not a presentation. It's I get in a conversation with you, and the whole point of my conversation is to convince you about anything.
Right.
It's convince you that the King James Bible is the best translation. It's to convince you that vanilla ice cream is the best ice cream in the world, or whatever. And the discussion part is essentially a point by point excursus of why. You know, I think that. I believe that. You should that.
With the anticipated outcome is that you'll come over to my side. I mean, we used to do that. The first many years of our relationship were very much about discussions rather than conversations. And we figured if you didn't agree with me, or I didn't agree with you, then I hadn't said it clearly enough, or enough times, or loudly enough.
Right.
So
exactly.
Yeah, we could escalate those.
Right. And that's the whole point.
Sure.
Is that you're trying to get a point across, and you're trying to get the other person to accept your point of view.
Well, and similarly is the debate. Now,
that's what happens when the discussion goes awry.
Right, yeah. I mean, it really gets to those, and I know you note that that debates are really arguments in disguise.
Yeah, and
maybe a little more civil.
Perhaps. What often happens in a discussion, of course, in a discussion when it denigrates, it is an argument, but what happens when a discussion becomes two people, both with agendas, you really end up with a debate instead of a discussion, because the discussion is generally one way. When you're going both ways, you're in a debate, and you're both trying to win a point. And although those can be a lot of fun. Don't get me wrong. There's nothing wrong with any of these forms of communication.
Sure.
I used to really enjoy Sunday school classes where we had multiple opportunities for sharing our opinions, and we would get into some very healthy debates. But we all understood that it was okay to do this, and that no one was really trying to convince anyone or expecting anyone to change their viewpoint. We were just having fun, and it was good. But when you're in the guise of a conversation, it can be extremely destructive.
Sure.
It's why this is the real reason why Christians aren't invited into the realm of conversation about spiritual things out in the marketplace. The reality is out in the marketplace today, spiritual conversations are abounding. I mean, go look at the self-help books, folks. You know, look at how many are by Deepak Chopra and Oprah, and others that are about spiritual topics. There's a huge conversation going out there. The problem is Christians, by and large, aren't invited to those conversations because we, have a reputation that we don't go to have a conversation. We go to have a discussion or debate. We have an agenda. and we try to twist people's arms or whatever, and get our point across and get them to accept our point instead of having a conversation. If we would learn the art of conversation, then we would be able to engage in these conversations, and actually evangelism become much more effective, because the difference between, I believe, in Christianity than all the other faiths is that we have something that's for real to offer, that is life-changing, and it has the power of Jesus Christ and the Holy Spirit and God the Creator behind it.
Yeah, one of the ironies is that the whole deal of Christianity is about relationship, you know, and so we're supposed to be about relationship with God, relationship with other people, relationship, you know, within ourselves. But when it comes to having spiritual conversations, part of the problem is that we don't do relationship, you know, that our conversations are relational. And I learn about you, I get to share a little bit about me, I get to learn a little bit more about you, I get to share a little bit more about me, but we have to have permission to have those kind of conversations.
And to go to the next level.
Relationship.
Well, and that, I think that's that brings us into the marks of an effective conversation. What does an effective conversation look like? And you know, the first thing about an effective conversation is it's open-minded. You don't go in with an agenda of, I'm going to win a point, or I'm going to walk away with a conversion, a notch in my belt, if you will.
Or this person's wrong. I mean, the minute you start to put right and wrong onto that conversation, it's moved outside of the conversation.
It's become a judgmental piece. Exactly.
So go ahead.
Well, okay, so open-mindedness, in not that you're necessarily going to change your mind. You know, one of the things that always has irritated me about the church is this whole piece of, let's not go where the unchurched are, let's not go into the dens of iniquity and etc., because somehow we're afraid it's going to rub off on us. Now, last I checked, Jesus said that we were the light of the world, we were the salt, we were to go and make a difference in those places, but if we never go in those places, how is the light ever going to get there? So, you know, the point is, we have to go where they are, and whether it's a coffee shop or the local pub or wherever it is, where you have to be where people are. And when you're with people like that, you have to be open-minded. Open-minded to be not wag your fingers, not look down your nose at what's going on. If you can't go to a place that without that carrying that with you, don't go there.
Yeah, well, let me say this, because we're going to talk a little bit, I hope, at some point about practicing having conversations. The reality is a lot of us don't do conversation with other people that we know and that we like, or people we even within our congregations with those kind of open minds that we, you know, these are my values, this is how I think, this is what's right, this is what's wrong, the way things are, and we're not listening, and we're not open to that. We're going to take offense at what people say. We're going to take difference with what people say and have to change their minds.
Right, and so you're going to these places, wherever it is, and the conversation you're going to engage in is about is give and take, and not trying to convince them that they're wrong or that they're in the wrong place or whatever. That doesn't happen overnight, and it certainly doesn't happen with a single conversation.
Sure. Well, and as you're saying, give and take, what you're really talking about there is, well, in addition to what you're also really talking about, is proportional listening. That the person with whom you're conversing speaks, and you listen, then you get to speak a little, and they listen. But it needs to be pretty much proportional, so that in fact there's something to be said if you're the one going to be guiding this conversation, or into future conversations, maybe you should be listening more than they listen. They have the opportunity to listen.
The whole goal of a proportional conversation is not 50-50.
Right.
It's proportionate based on how many ears and how many mouths you have.
Oh, I see.
God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth to be used in that proportion.
Gotcha.
And if you're going to lead spiritual conversations, and that's the goal here, we're talking about leading spiritual conversations, then you actually do most of the listening. You don't talk unless you're invited to talk. That's how you build a really good that's conversational. Is you know what do you think?
Right.
You know, I ask you a question, and you expound on it, and then you might respond with a question and say, well, what do you think, or whatever, and then you've been invited to share. Otherwise, the most effective piece is to ask another question.
Right.
So,
and if you're not good at that, then write some questions down. I mean, literally, I used to carry around little note cards. And when we had children, when I was at home when the children were really, really young, I didn't get to have a lot of adult conversations, and sometimes I giggle because I hear that from mothers or dads who are home a lot with their children and have taken time out, and they'll say, do I sound funny? Am I blithering? Or what am I making any sense? I don't have very many adult conversations, and I always giggle at that because I remember how I'd forgotten that opportunity.
Exactly.
Okay, so we want to talk good conversations, open-minded, proportional listening, but we also show authentic interest. We just don't ask banal questions. We're wanting to learn more about that person.
Right, it has to be authentic.
Right,
authentic. The whole point of a spiritual conversation is, again, if you're gone with an agenda, it's a discussion.
Right.
Okay, it's not a conversation.
Right.
Just because you intend to have a spiritual conversation doesn't mean that you have an agenda other than to have a conversation. Let's let the Holy Spirit get in here and do the guiding. Let's depend on, or count on the Holy Spirit having gone before us and prepared the way so that we have something to say, and we get invited at an appropriate time when the person, whoever we're talking with, has an appropriate place where they can hear the message that we need to bring or that we're prompted to bring, whether it's our own personal faith story or whether it's the answer of a question about the Christianity as a whole or religion or God or whatever.
Well, it may be a word of encouragement even. There's that whole piece of, if you will, in listening, to listen with a third ear, perhaps, to listen.
Your spiritual ear, absolutely.
Right, exactly.
Maybe that's right. So, 3 ears in one mouth.
I don't know, Yeah, if you're to go with chakras and things like that, you've got this kind of middle piece here, right?
Right.
Okay, so, but that's an eye, not an ear. Well, anyways, there are times when I'm listening that I'm also having a little conversation, and I don't know exactly how to explain that, but to say, God, what would you have me to say? Or if somebody's talking, one of the challenges some people have is that they get really caught up emotionally in what people are saying. They get angry on their behalf, or, someone's really pouring out some of the tough stuff going on in their lives. They may, as I say, get angry, or they may feel real deep compassion for them. And so to kind of not get too caught up in that conversation, but to remember, in having a spiritual conversation, you also have the opportunity to be God's voice and to let the Spirit, if you will, speak through you. And so you're wanting to keep a little distance, let them speak for themselves, and then be able to be open to the possibility of speaking on God's behalf.
Well, that's what self-differentiation, if you will, is all about.
Yeah, that's good. That's
and
really
if you're going to have an authentic conversation, you have to be self-differentiated, which means you don't get hooked in to what they're saying.
Right.
Again, I often reference Paul's experience up at Mars Hill in Athens and all those idols and everything, and he didn't get hooked into even his own emotions of how disturbed he was by the idols. He went in and was able to have a conversation that was helpful. And so really understanding that you are who you are, I am who I am, and if you're having deep issues, or you say something or you believe something that I think is totally wrong, it's being self-differentiated. That means that, wow, that's what you believe. That's interesting. And why do you believe that? Or, so tell me more about that, instead of saying, well, let me tell you why you're wrong.
Right. Exactly.
To get more information so you can understand, because understanding is way more important than anything else.
Right. Right. And you want to stay double self-differentiated. You want to not only differentiate yourself from what they're saying, but not to glom onto them. You're not there for them to take up your banner or to feel sorry for you or anything else like that. So you want to do that a double fold. All right. So then another piece of a good conversation is to ask only the questions, or answer only the questions that are asked. Right. They've got a question that may be coming at you, but don't make up the questions.
Well, and we often go thinking that they have questions that we want to answer.
That's good. Right.
We often think people are worried about eternal salvation, what we're going to spend eternity. And, if you ask people on their top 100 things they're worried about, that almost never shows up.
Right.
And yet that is where we come from in our perspective as Christians of, that's the most important question. Well, that may be, but it's not to them.
Right.
So don't be answering the question that's not asked.
Right.
Answer the questions that get asked. So if they ask, about, well, what do you think about my religion? you want to be honest, but you don't want to be wagging your finger, judgmental, and answer a different question.
Well, yeah. Well, and that's a good point. The question that you just asked was, what do you think about my religion? It wasn't to put it down. It wasn't to say, well, mine's better than yours. What do I think? If I don't know anything about your religion, except that it's not my religion, or it's not Christianity, I don't get to weigh in on that one.
And a good question would be, I know so little. Tell me more about it. What's your perspective on God? What's your perspective on and listen. And at that point, by the way, you're already in a deep spiritual conversation. And if you'll do more listening, they will invite you to share what you believe.
Right.
If you are a good listener and don't interject. Right. What trying to get your point across. They will ask if you will be authentic. It may not be this conversation, but ultimately they will.
Which really brings us back to a piece of evangelism. Know what you believe. You don't have to know everything. You don't have to know answers or anything else, but you do need to know you have a relationship with Jesus, and why do you have that? What difference does your faith make? I mean, it's very basic. What difference does your faith make in your life? Or what another way to say it is, what does your relationship with Jesus, what difference does that make in your life? If you don't know how to answer that, then think, if I didn't have Jesus in my life, then this is how my life would be. But you've got to be able to do that, because I think one of the reasons that we're afraid to do evangelism, and maybe even why our pastors don't encourage us to do evangelism, is because we're afraid that you might get out there with those folks and that they might sway you over to their side, which means you're not really clear about where you are.
And we find that really is one of the key issues in the church, because we don't really understand, which is, let's talk about how do you create spiritual conversations. Well, the first way spiritual conversations happen is they always happen out of overflow.
Yeah, good.
And it's overflow. Right. And that's really what it is are you prayed up? Is your spiritual life where it maybe not where it needs to be, because none of us are where we need to be.
No, right.
But is it continually being filled, or are you running on empty?
Go ahead. No, go. I'm sorry.
Because if you're running on empty, you have nothing to share.
Right.
And if you have overflow, you can't help but share what's going on in your life.
Sure. Or how's your relationship with Jesus? I often think of that in terms of my relationship with you, different relationships. But am I mad at him right now? Have I spent any time talking to him lately? I just can't imagine going a day, 2 days. I don't know. Maybe we've gone somewhere in 19 years, 24 hours without talking to each other. I don't think I could pinpoint any time.
I can when you go into silence.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Silent retreats.
Okay,
yeah.
But then I'm talking to Jesus. So how long has it been since I've talked to him? And if I haven't been talking to him, then I'm really not on good grounding to talk to somebody else about him.
Exactly.
Right. So we've got to be really, really in a a good place.
Right. Keep
a decent place.
Bible reading, scripture reading. Are you attending worship? Are you? I want to be very careful how I say this, but I want to say, are you being fed at worship? And what I mean by that is, are you going there and eating? Because they're making a presentation. Your pastor, your church is giving, is serving a buffet. The question is, are you going to bother to partake? That's one of the biggest issues we have is, I'm not fed. What? We need to take a spoon and put it in your mouth? We did worship. Engage.
Right.
But,
and I like that idea that it's a buffet, that you could have taken as something from something. There was the music, there were the prayers, it wasn't just the message, it was all these pieces.
Right, exactly. So, so overflow. And if you have overflow, your spiritual conversations come pretty automatically.
So then you got to draw them in.
Right, and I just want to point to the Hitchhiker's Guide to Evangelism book. If you really want to have a list, and that's why I wrote that book, is the Hitchhiker's Guide to Evangelism really is many, many ways in which to draw people into your space and to draw people into conversation with you. And there's lots of different ways. Everything from the radical of, we have a son who has a very ornate tattoo that he gets questions about fairly regularly, and he's able to share his faith that way. To something very simple as, hanging a picture in your office that is not over the top in your face, but invites conversation about spirituality.
Kind of like our picture here,
right, exactly.
That we keep behind us. Well, all right, and you shouted out for the Hitchhiker's Guide to Evangelism book, but let's also talk about that Hitchhiker's Guide to Evangelism site, or that ministry, which you can get to and find out more from flipmychurch.com, because it's got the training videos and it's got monthly videos, and regularly the motivationals. Regularly we're talking about how to draw people into these spiritual conversations, how to have them, how to practice them, and whatnot.
Right.
So those are real good resources.
Okay, in the conversation, you know, when you're having a regular conversation, if you want to have a spiritual conversation, the next thing you need to do really is listen for detour opportunities.
I think of them as segues.
Segues, good.
Okay, is that, yeah, detours, I don't know, that just sounded too out of the way for me.
Well, for me, it's about the hitchhiker's language, you know, when you're traveling and it's looking for a detour. It's looking for a way off of the conversation that you're having to take you on a detour into the spiritual realm. And, you know, there's lots of ways in which to do that. Again, if you're coming out of overflow, it just comes naturally anyway. I can't not talk about my faith when I'm with unbelievers, not because I'm overwhelming, but because I see those detours. The opportunities are there so often. Someone will mention something going on in their life, and I'll say, wow, you know, I remember a story about, or, you know, once when I, you know, and again, I own it, I'm self-differentiated, but the conversations, they just automatically steer that direction, and you know, the conversations come. So look for those detour opportunities to take the conversation next level. Another one, go ahead, is to be genuine, to be authentic, and here's the key, folks, is to be transparent, which means to be you. I mean, that's really what we're talking about, is to really be you, take down some of your walls, and share. Open authentically when you're asked to share.
Well, and you know what kicks me is how often we hear about other people's stories that will, you know, if we get an opportunity to share, we're going to talk about the Bible story, but we can't talk about our own story. And while those are important pieces that we can help to show that transcendence, and how this how our faith and how faith moves across, you know, the
meta story, that they're not familiar with,
right, exactly, and that's so important. But what they really want to know is, what difference is it making in your life? I don't really care about that person. And you know, pastors and preachers, I'm going to speak to preachers for a minute, whether they're pastors or not, is that so often we're using other people's stories, and lectionary resources are great, and have used them many times myself and refer to them all the time. But if all you're doing is telling the story that's somebody else's story that they're telling, it's not reaching the depths that it can. You've got to tell your connections, and you've got to allow people in your church to be able to share their connections.
Well, you have to help them to be able to. One of the keys that we don't do in the church is we teach the stories of the faith. We teach the facts of the faith, and we call that the good news. And in 1980, laying out the facts was good news. But today, those facts are, if you will, tainted, because they come from the Bible, which in the Bible has no more credibility than any other book today. I mean, it's on equal weight with the Quran and all the rest, you know, outside of the Christian circles.
Well, with all those self-help books, or all the books that talk about this and that and tear out the Bible. In fact, I just saw one talking about Jesus probably wasn't crucified on a cross, written by an evangelical scholar. So, you know, I mean, there are all those pieces out there. But I also want to say that our experience are factual, you know, and so it's a different kind. It's a relational.
You can't argue with your experience.
Exactly. Well, with that being genuine and authentic and transparent, it's also got to be relevant. I mean, don't tell a story, because again, we memorize our story. Here's my story, and I'm going to tell you my story, but it might not be relevant at all, and you might miss a chance. So if it's not relevant in this setting, pray for an opportunity when you will get to share for another piece of relevance.
That comes back to the whole piece. The goal of conversation is not to do a conversion. The whole goal of a conversation is to leave the door open for future conversations. Don't get in a hurry. You know, it takes an average, in today's world, it takes an average of 3 years, I should say in today's world, in today's culture, it takes 3 years from the first conversation until someone says, you know, I want to be a part of this faith. And so don't be in a hurry. It's about a series of conversations.
Keep them open.
The last thing I want to say is just, you got to steer gently. When you're in a conversation, again, you have the 3 years, steer it gently.
Well, honey, I hate to cut you off, but we are like out of time. Next week, we're going to talk about investing in the real future of the church.
All right, so join us then. Thanks. We'll see you next week.
Have a great week.